Wild forests are emblematic of nature and, like nature, are often overlooked for the role they play in making possible humanity's survival, especially considering that they are our best ally in the effort to halt the climate emergency. I want to draw attention to the fact that I didn't just use the word forest, I used the term wild forest. Why? Compared to plantations and other managed areas, the ecological value and benefits of wild forests are unique and irreplaceable. A term many use to describe wild forests is primary forest, that is intact, largely undisturbed forest. These areas are Earth's largest above-ground carbon storage and contain between 50 to 100 parts per million carbon. If you consider that 350 parts per million is where we need to be to maintain pre-industrial temperatures, and we're currently at 412 parts per million, and 450 parts per million is where we exceed 1.5 degrees and enter into the most cataclysmic effects of the climate emergency. I think it's clear how vitally essential wild forests are to our survival. This is just one of many examples illustrating how forests specifically, and wildlands in general, are irreplaceable cornerstones of human civilization. And if we consider the sum contribution of wild areas to our survival, I think most of us will quickly arrive at a very important question. How much nature do we as a society actually need to survive, and in what time frame? Because I work in wilderness conservation, I have an affinity for forests that could bias my answer to this question. So let's briefly consult some third parties in science and economics to arrive at a more impartial answer. 50% of Earth's land and seas is what the scientific consensus is. The reason for this is that nature is a 400 million year old life support engine, the only planetary scale one we have, that produces everything, in the words of a very famous conservationist, that humans need most, except for love. And when we destroy too much of nature, we risk crossing ecological thresholds known as tipping points. Crossing tipping points collapses the functionality of the entire ecosystem, meaning that you lose ecological services at an exponential rate. Scientists agree that on average, the ecological threshold is approximately 50%. Now, some ecosystems are more fragile, like rainforests. They require 70 to 80%. But in general, if you can hold on to 50% of most ecosystems, you can maintain most of their functionality. What does that functionality look like? 1.6 billion livelihoods, that's 1 in 5 people, are directly derived from wild nature. All of Earth's oxygen, which comes from the fragile phytoplankton in the ocean and the complex interaction between the GI systems of wildlife, bats, rhinos, primates, and the microorganisms in the soil, which make wild forests more likely to grow, persist, and continue to produce oxygen. And up to 70% of rainfall. If you look at South America alone, and the southern part of South America, a globally significant agricultural area, 70% of the rainfall there is produced by the rainforests. When we remove parts of the rainforest, we jeopardize that rainfall and the food security that's derived from it. If we are to avoid crossing a threshold that would result in the collapse of these ecological services and others, we must set aside approximately half the planet. There's a lot of talk about 50 by 50, protecting half the planet by 2050. In fact, there's a high ambition coalition of 14 countries led by France and Costa Rica that is advocating for just that. And I applaud them for embracing the scientific consensus and the need for half. But I'd like to challenge them on the time frame, because 2050 is neither ecologically nor economically feasible. Here's why. By 2050, we are on track to add 25 million kilometers of roads to Earth's surface. That's enough road to encircle the planet 600 times. And if any of you have ever watched a time lapse of road construction in forests, you know just exactly how devastating roads are for the wild ecology around them. By 2050, we're on track to double the urban square footage of our planet. And that leads to the question, where will we put nature after that happens? What space will we have remaining between the 40% of our surface that is already given to agriculture and the rest given to urban areas? Also, we are currently perched on the half threshold right now. We have just about half of the planet remaining in 2020 to protect. Good thing that the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration starts in 2021, not a moment too soon, because we will certainly need to restore in order to meet this important target. So when is it going to be more feasible to protect half? When we still have approximately half left to protect? Or when we must go back and undo 3 decades of misguided and inefficient infrastructure? Let me put this another way. We're about to embark into unmapped terrain. Never before in our species' history or in the history of our planet have our forests been so tattered and our wildlands so fragmented. Do we want to engage in that experiment now, when we need all the nature we can get to have any hopes of successfully addressing the climate emergency? The scientific consensus is that we need to protect half by 2030. Fortunately, we have tools to do that. Tools that can protect our wild forests and wild lands. But these tools require users who are willing to pick them up. I'm going to briefly mention some of these tools and then hand it over to Crista, who will discuss how we can generate the political will to use them in a very short amount of time. The first tool are official protected areas, International Union for the Conservation of Nature approved areas. These are cornerstones of biodiversity, and they're primarily wielded by state actors. Not exclusively by state actors, but primarily. The second tool are other effective conservation measures, or OECMs. These include indigenous land stewardship. Indigenous peoples make up 5% of Earth's human population, but they steward close to 40% of our remaining wildlands and 80% of our biodiversity. We have a lot to learn from Indigenous leadership. And finally, voluntary conservation areas. These are primarily for non-state actors, municipalities, corporations, individuals, and are being developed in advance of the UN Decade of Restoration and to be rolled out over the course of the next few years. Now I'd like to hand this over to Crista Valentino.
Excuse me. Thanks, Amy. So achieving 50% of our planet's land and water can't be and shouldn't be just a decision made by governing bodies. Since the deliverance of the necessary protocols, projects, and the implementation is being done by those who are on the ground, who are in communities. Inherently, people want to protect their homes. They want to protect the places where they and their families live, work, and play. So to be able to protect 50% of our planet's land and water, not just by 2030, but for our planet to be able to also continue to sustain life in all forms, people around the world must know that their innate desire to love and conserve these places is not only supported, but it's necessary for all of humanity to survive and thrive. And what's also important is for them to know that we are behind them. So that's why we're leading the effort to reach over 100 million people worldwide. We're calling this the survival revolution, in audiences in countries not often considered by mainstream conservation groups. We're here to remind them that their survival is dependent on the survival of the wild world around them, and to urge them to support policies and the actions in national and global levels that will result in the protection of 50% of the planet by 2030. But the work that must happen doesn't stop with education and outreach. We must also spark substantive actions in communities around the world. There's a great systemic issue when it comes to conservation. Decisions have often been based upon the words of Western experts. Historically, these experts are of European descent, are educated through systemized academia, and they place a great importance on quantitative data analysis and numbers. That methodology has gotten us this far, and it's important. But for us to get to where we've never been, to a place where maybe half of our planet receives the care, protection, and respect she deserves, we have to be willing to do things we've never done. In most cases, systemic change requires societal-wide transformation, and often the best solutions come from those who are unheard in the current paradigm, because they are already adapting to the challenges without establishment support. So who isn't being heard? Youth, Indigenous and Native peoples, rural and underserved communities, often residing in the global South. 56% of the world's population is made up of Indigenous and Native peoples and individuals under the age of 30. That's over half of our society being left out of the conversation. Over half of people on the planet whose ideas aren't being considered, whose solutions aren't being supported, and whose voices aren't being heard. Here's the key though. We cannot just ask these unheard voices to speak up and act out. We must create a space for them and these untapped minds and ambitions to act with confidence and with conviction in what they know is right. For the last 8 years, I've been tirelessly working to develop a space like this for youth, one built on the foundation that young people have the answers to the most pressing challenges facing themselves, their communities, and their passion. Rather than showing or telling them the way forward, we at CoalitionWILD do just the opposite. We step out of the way. On the outside, we provide skill set building resources, we offer support networks and encouragement, and we work to build confidence in their leadership abilities. But behind the scenes, we work to remove the barriers that are hindering the progress of these youth. And this might be systemic, it might be generational, discrimination, or cultural. And we curate an inclusive place that genuinely and energetically believes in the ability for any single person to create the change that they wish to see. In practice, what this looks like is a ripple effect. In 2019, we worked with a young woman named Meredith in Africa, who over 9 months, she deployed 1,000 camera traps over 4 countries. She then took all of this footage she gained from the camera traps and engaged almost 70,000 volunteers around the world in a citizen science project, analyzing, categorizing, and identifying the data captured. Meredith alone facilitated 70,000 opportunities to educate, spark passion, and foster curiosity. The greatest thing that I have learned through all of this is that youth, Indigenous peoples, and overall, just those who are underrepresented and often unheard, that they don't need to be helped and they don't need to be saved. What they need is the space to thrive. Give them that and then get out of the way. Nature needs half, period. And she won't get what she deserves unless we amplify the voices and work of the underrepresented and place a greater importance on the weight of the knowledge of those who are working on the ground in these areas. In order to defend nature, we must also defend Indigenous peoples, youth, and other marginalized communities. So where does leadership start? Leadership for the forest and leadership for nature. We think that leadership comes from multiple parts of society, but the ones that we're most likely to influence early on is the one that will carry forward and will increase official commitments later on. These are grassroots outreach. So if we're going to save our forests, we need to give our attention to the engagement and the mobilization of those at the grassroots level. Without that, we won't be able to save our forests. Thank you.